Members, the motion is that the question be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party will be supporting the first reading of this tariff reduction bill. Mr Speaker, it's well known that there is a high level of agreement across the House between the two main parties that New Zealand is a trading nation which it has economic advantages from facing less barriers to that trade abroad. The average rate of tariff into New Zealand, I think the Minister can tell me if I've got this wrong, but I think it's between 2 and 3% is the average tariff that's faced by other countries who are selling goods to New Zealand. In contrast, for a lot of our products overseas, we face tariffs of over 100% into some of our major markets. And of course, that means that the amount of money that is received by the New Zealand seller is less because they're facing that tariff barrier at the border overseas. We are proud of being a pro-trade party. We are pleased to claim some substantial credit, most of which goes to the Honourable Phil Goff for the Chinese Free Trade Agreement. At the time of the Free Trade Agreement with China, bilateral trade was about $2 billion per annum. It peaked at about $12 billion and it's still over about $10 billion. It might drop a little bit under that with the drop in the dairy prices. But a massive increase in the two-way trade between China and New Zealand. Sorry, did I?
Exports are 10 billion.
Yeah, exports are 10 billion and imports are about the same. Yeah, so bilateral trade each way is about that amount. This tariff bill, sir, is supported by us for that reason. If we don't pass this bill in Parliament, not only will we not have the advantage of those tariff reductions, our exporters will face competitive disadvantage in Korea when competing against other countries that face lower tariffs, most notably Australia, who already has a free trade agreement with South Korea, which means that all other things being equal, if a New Zealand exporter faces a higher tariff going into South Korea than an Australian company, then either the returns to the prices that's charged by a New Zealand seller has to be lower than the Australian price, or you won't get the deal because of the differential in the two tariffs. So, sir, this is overall a good free trade agreement, and for that reason we support it. I want to thank the Select Committee for the way in which the Select Committee was willing to put up with the opposition's questions, and we did hog question time because we wanted to explore some of the criticisms that are being made in civil society, where some very well-meaning people in society are getting very anxious about not so much the trade in goods permitted under free trade agreements, but some of the rules relating to services and in particular rules relating to investment protocols. I think one of the reasons why we are now having protest marches around the country, anti-TPP rallies that attract thousands of people, is that we are not having an open enough discourse with members of the public as to the concerns that they legitimately hold. They're not always right in their concerns, but it is their right to hold those concerns and to express them, and it is the duty of this Parliament, and in particular the government, to engage with these issues so that they can shed light upon the issues at large. The common complaints that we hear are, for example, that New Zealand will have to change our laws in a way that accommodates the wishes of the country that we've got a free trade agreement with. And I don't think New Zealand's done a very good job of this in the last 6 years, with due respect, the Honourable Mr Grosser. I do think we need to do better on this, otherwise you're going to have this rising discontent, some of which is misplaced and some of which is well placed, and I want to consider both sides of that. First of all, I would record the very clear advice that we had from officials, and can I thank them for the advice they tendered the Select Committee, who made it absolutely clear that this agreement requires absolutely no change to New Zealand's labour laws, no change to our property laws, no change to our taxation laws, no change to our intellectual property laws, no change to our health laws, our public health laws, or our environmental laws. Now, I think if a lot of the submitters knew that, and they had, or hearing that, and I hope they do listen to that, would be somewhat, their concerns would be at least in part addressed. In respect of the freedom of future governments to to act. We drilled into this a lot at Select Committee. One of the concerns that submitters raised, and I'll just, actually before I address that, I'll just address the process. Normally the process for consideration of free trade agreements under the current government is very, very truncated. Now, we understand that once you enter into a free trade agreement, you want to take advantage of the economic advantages that flow from reduced tariffs faced by our exporters as soon as possible. And that's a proper objective. But it does have to be balanced with the right of the public to actually express their concern and have their concerns heard and dealt with properly. Now, on this occasion, we had the normal 15 sitting day requirement when the treaty came before Parliament. It was referred to Select Committee and the motion gave us 15 sitting days, which is generally only 3 weeks. But because we had a 3-week recess in that period, we managed to extend it effectively to 6 weeks. That meant that we could give a period of advertising to interested people. We gave them time to give us submissions, and we had some very detailed and thorough submissions to us, and then we had time to consider them. And as a consequence, I think we at Select Committee, with the agreement of all parties, including some parties who are less pro-trade than we are in the Labour Party, cooperated to write what I thought was a very good report. And so I would congratulate all members of the Select Committee on all sides, plus the officials who helped us achieve that outcome. In respect of effects on the ability of future governments to take action, these generally fall into sort of 3 areas of concern. Constraints on the ability of a future government to legislate for public health, constraints on the ability to legislate for environmental outcomes, and your inability to control your own destiny when it comes to things like land sales. Again, we had very clear advice from officials that there is no curb on proper legislation for public health reasons going forward. And the example that we used, and we had very clear advice from the officials, was that, for example, if the government wanted to introduce plain packaging on cigarettes, then that would not breach the free trade agreement. We had submissions from some submitters saying that there is somehow a chilling effect on the way in which governments might respond to that, saying that that was one of the reasons behind delay for the current government's implementation of what Tariana Turia was pushing as Associate Minister of Health, which was plain packaging on cigarettes, but we were told by the government that that's not correct. In respect of future restrictions or proper environmental laws, like an increase to the price of carbon or other measures that you need to curb carbon emissions, again, we had assurances from officials that that was permitted. In respect of the third area, though, there is a problem, and that relates to whether a future government can limit or can ban new categories of land from being sold to overseas people, in this case South Koreans. And we had advice from Amakura Kafaru. Now, Amakura Kafaru is the author or the co-author of the leading text on commercial arbitration in New Zealand. It's called Williams and Kafaru on Arbitration. She's also an academic at the University of Auckland, and she gave us advice that it was not possible to add new categories of land that can be, the sale of which can be banned to foreigners, in this case South Koreans. And I think that is a problem in the drafting of this agreement, and it needs to be made clear, I would hope by a side letter, and I would hope that future agreements are clearer that that is permitted by a future government, because although the current government might not want to have a ban on overseas land sales, other governments properly might want to, and their ability to do so should not be constrained by free trade agreements. I want to, in my last minute, sir, say something about, and similarly, sir, in respect of stamp duty that applies only to some overseas purchases rather to New Zealand residents as well. Both of these practices are common overseas, and indeed the Australians managed to accommodate both of those matters in their free trade agreement with South Korea, so we should have been able to achieve that also. Last thing, investor state settlement provisions, sir. These are very controversial. There are still some problems with the international mechanisms. Judges that are, arbitrators and panels that are drawn from trade lawyers are faced with the accusation that they're really not like an independent judiciary. They do go back to being trade lawyers, so they arguably aren't quite as independent as a judicial officer should be expected to be. There are limited appeal rights. And there is a question whether, particularly in respect of first world countries, you should have investor investors having rights to sue the state, or whether you should just have country-to-country enforcement of agreements, which is what has happened previously in respect of most agreements. Now, I know we've got ISDS clauses in the Chinese FTA, and that's, and that is a good agreement. But we've reached the point in the Labour Party where we would be happy to have free trade agreements with first world countries without ISDS clauses. And it's interesting that countries such as Europe, Australia, there seems to be an appetite, and indeed the United States, there seems to be an appetite for that too. So with those comments, I note again that the Labour Party is supporting this bill.